Welcome to Ranking. Today we are talking about history, but not the history you learned in school. We are not covering dates, wars, or the names of kings. We are covering the facts that completely destroy your mental picture of how time works. The facts where ancient history and modern history are not separated by thousands of years of empty time, but are constantly overlapping in ways that nobody tells you about. These are the facts that make history feel alive, strange, and deeply interconnected. Facts that have been verified by historians and archaeologists, sourced from the actual record, and that will permanently change how you think about when things happened. Let's go. Oxford University is older than the Aztec Empire. Oxford University is older than the Aztec Empire. Teaching at Oxford University began around the year 1096 and developed rapidly after 1167. The University of Oxford has been operating continuously for over 900 years. The Aztec Empire, the civilization famous for its pyramids, its capital city Tenochtitlan, and its dominance over central Mexico, was founded in 1428. Oxford was already a 300-year-old institution with established colleges, libraries, and centuries of graduates when the Aztec Empire was founded. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico and encountered what seemed like an impossibly ancient civilization, Oxford had already been teaching students for longer than the Aztec Empire would ever exist. The Aztec Empire lasted less than 100 years before Spanish conquest ended it in 1521. Oxford is still running. This collision of timelines reveals how misleading the categories of ancient, medieval, and modern history really are. We tend to think of Aztec civilization as something ancient, and European universities as something modern, but they were contemporaries, and the European institution is the one that has survived. Cleopatra lived closer to the moon landing than to the Great Pyramid. Cleopatra and the moon landing. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the figure synonymous with ancient Egypt, died in 30 BC. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BC. That means Cleopatra lived approximately 2,530 years after the Great Pyramid was built. The Apollo 11 moon landing happened in 1969 AD. Cleopatra died roughly 2,000 years before that. In other words, Cleopatra was almost 500 years closer in time to Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon than she was to the builders of the pyramid that serves as her civilization's most iconic symbol. She was practically a modern person compared to the Old Kingdom Egyptians. The Great Pyramid is so ancient that it is ancient, even relative to most of what we call ancient history. When Roman tourists visited Egypt and marveled at the pyramids were already over 2,000 years old. They were as old to Roman tourists as Roman ruins are to us today. History is far deeper than the compressed version we usually work with. Woolly mammoths were still alive when the Great Pyramid was built. Woolly mammoths and the Great Pyramid. Woolly mammoths did not go extinct 10,000 years ago. While the vast majority of mammoths did die out around that time as the Ice Age ended, a small isolated population survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until approximately 1650 BC. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BC. Egyptian civilization was already ancient. The pyramids had been standing for 900 years when the last woolly mammoths finally went extinct. While pharaohs ruled Egypt, while people walked through the streets of Memphis and Thebes, while scribes wrote on papyrus and traders sailed the Nile, small hairy mammoths were still wandering a remote Arctic island. The coexistence of Ice Age megafauna and Bronze Age civilization sounds impossible, but it is simply true. Mammoths are not a relic of a prehistoric world separated from human civilization by vast gulfs of time. They overlap with recorded history. The ancient Egyptians had been building monuments for nearly a millennium before the last mammoth died. Had they known about Wrangel Island, they could have gone to see one. The fax machine is older than the telephone. The fax machine is older than the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell is credited with patenting the telephone in 1876. The fax machine, or at least its direct mechanical ancestor, was patented in 1843 by Scottish inventor Alexander Bain, who called it an electric printing telegraph. Bain's device could transmit images of documents over telegraph wires by scanning them with a pendulum and reproducing them at the other end using chemically treated paper. The concept of transmitting documents electronically existed more than 30 years before voice could be transmitted over a wire. The technology evolved through the 1860s and 1870s, with Giovanni Caselli's pantelegraph commercially transmitting documents in France starting in 1865, over a decade before the telephone existed. We tend to think of fax machines as a clunky precursor to email, something that came between the telephone and the internet. In fact, the fax precedes the telephone. It precedes recorded sound. It is one of the earliest forms of electronic communication, and it existed before the technology required to carry a human voice. Nintendo was founded before the Eiffel Tower was built. Nintendo, before the Eiffel Tower. Nintendo, the company that made Super Mario, Zelda, and Pokémon, was founded in 1889. The Eiffel Tower was completed in 1889. Nintendo is older than the Eiffel Tower. More precisely, Nintendo was founded in September 1889, and the Eiffel Tower was inaugurated in May of the same year, making them essentially contemporaries, though Nintendo was founded months after the tower's completion. Nintendo was not, of course, making video games in 1889. Founder Fusajiro Yamauchi established the company to manufacture and sell Hanafuda, traditional Japanese playing cards. The company spent its first 75 years primarily in the playing card business, with various expansions into toys and other products, before eventually entering the arcade game market in the 1970s. The company that brought you Donkey Kong in 1981 was already 90 years old. It is older than commercial airlines, older than most countries in their modern form, and older than most of the infrastructure of the modern world. Nintendo has existed through 2 world wars, the entire Cold War, and the complete rise of digital computing, all while starting as a card game company. France was still using the guillotine when Star Wars was released. The guillotine in Star Wars. Star Wars was released in May 1977. The last guillotine execution in France took place on September 10, 1977, just 4 months later. Hamida Jandubi was executed by guillotine at Baumetz prison in Marseille. France did not abolish capital punishment until 1981. This means that when audiences were watching Luke Skywalker blow up the Death Star, France was still executing people by the mechanism designed during the Enlightenment. The guillotine feels like a relic of the French Revolution, something belonging to the 1790s alongside powdered wigs and horse-drawn carriages. It is in fact a 20th century technology, still in use well within living memory, in a wealthy Western European democracy, during the era of disco music and microprocessors. The year 1977 contained both A New Hope and the last judicial use of the guillotine. History does not sort itself into neat eras. Old things persist alongside new things in ways that seem impossible until you look at the actual dates. The Ottoman Empire was still alive during the First World War. The Ottoman Empire and the modern world. The Ottoman Empire is often thought of as a medieval institution, Islamic caliphate, sultans, janissary armies, the siege of Vienna. In fact, the Ottoman Empire survived until 1922. It fought in World War I. It had a navy, an air force, and machine guns. Ottoman soldiers used modern rifles and artillery. The empire that had ruled much of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe for 6 centuries was issuing passports, operating telegraphs, and running railroads when it finally collapsed after World War I. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, was removed from power in November 1922, the same year that the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. Insulin was first used to treat diabetes, and the BBC was founded. Institutions we think of as ancient and institutions we think of as modern were alive simultaneously. The Ottoman Empire overlapped with jazz, with automobiles, and with the early days of cinema. History does not kill off old institutions on schedule. Harvard was founded before calculus was invented. Harvard before calculus. Harvard University was founded in 1636. Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed calculus independently during the 1660s and 1670s, with Newton's key insights dating from around 1666. When Harvard opened its doors to its first students, calculus did not exist as a field of mathematics. Harvard was teaching students for 30 years before the invention of the mathematical tool that would later become the foundation of physics. engineering, and virtually all of modern science. The university predates Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, by half a century. It predates the discovery of oxygen, the germ theory of disease, the steam engine, and electricity. Harvard graduates from the institution's early years lived in a world where bloodletting was mainstream medicine, where the Earth was believed to be about 6,000 years old, and where nobody had the faintest understanding of why an apple fell from a tree. The institution is old enough that the entire scientific revolution happened after it was established. The Great Fire of London and Isaac Newton. The Great Fire of London and Isaac Newton. The Great Fire of London burned in September 1666, destroying over 13,000 houses and 87 churches, including the original St. Paul's Cathedral. It is one of the defining disasters of English history. In 1666, Isaac Newton was 23 years old and living in rural Lincolnshire, having evacuated Cambridge to escape an outbreak of plague. During the same year, the Great Fire reduced much of London to ash. Newton was making his most revolutionary discoveries, developing the foundations of calculus, conducting his famous prism experiments with light, and formulating his early ideas about gravity after, according to legend, observing a falling apple. The Annus Mirabilis, Latin for Year of Wonders, is what Newton called 1666. While London burned, the foundations of modern physics were being laid 130 miles away in a farmhouse. The catastrophe that destroyed a city, and the intellectual revolution that would transform human understanding of the universe, were simultaneous events in the same small country. History's disasters and breakthroughs are rarely separated by comfortable distances. Mary Queen of Scots and Shakespeare were contemporaries. Mary Queen of Scots and Shakespeare. Mary Queen of Scots was executed in February 1587. William Shakespeare wrote most of his greatest plays in the 1590s and 1600s. They were alive at the same time. Shakespeare was 23 years old when Mary was beheaded. He was already working as an actor in London. The romantic tragedy of Mary, the imprisoned Catholic queen executed by her Protestant cousin, Elizabeth I, was recent living memory when Shakespeare was at the height of his powers. The political world that produced Macbeth, with its themes of usurpation, murderous ambition, and the instability of royal power, was not historical to Shakespeare. It was current events. Elizabeth I attended performances of Shakespeare's plays. The Globe Theatre was built in 1599, 12 years after Mary's death. When we place Shakespeare in a sepia-toned Elizabethan era, and Mary Queen of Scots in her own separate Romantic era, we obscure the fact that they breathed the same political air, lived under the same monarch, and their worlds overlapped completely. Sharks are older than trees. Sharks are older than trees. Sharks have existed as a distinct category of marine life for approximately 450 million years. Trees, as in woody plants with true lignin, the material that makes wood hard, did not evolve until approximately 385 million years ago. For tens of millions of years, the ocean was full of sharks while the land had no trees. Just ferns, mosses, and primitive plants without woody tissue. Sharks swam through ancient oceans before a single forest existed on Earth. Sharks predate dinosaurs by about 200 million years. They predate the evolution of flowers. They predate the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs, and they survived it. They have survived 5 mass extinction events total, events that wiped out the majority of complex life on Earth. The shark body plan is so effective that it has barely changed in hundreds of millions of years. While entire ecosystems rose and fell, while continents split and drifted, while mammals evolved from small shrew-like creatures into every form of land animal alive today, sharks remained essentially sharks. They are older than the concept of a tree. They are older than anything with roots. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was already leaning during construction. The Leaning Tower of Pisa started leaning immediately. Construction of the Leaning Tower of Pisa began in 1173 AD. Within a few years of work, the soft ground on one side began to compress unevenly, and the tower started to tilt. Construction was halted not once, but multiple times due to wars, and these century-long pauses may actually have saved the building, giving the soil time to compress and settle and preventing total collapse. The tower wasn't completed until 1372, almost 200 years after construction began. When Galileo Galilei used the tower for his famous experiments on gravity and falling objects in the 1580s. The tower was already 400 years old, and had been leaning for its entire existence. It has been leaning for longer than the United States has been a country, longer than the printing press has existed, longer than the European colonization of the Americas. When engineers undertook remediation work in the 1990s to keep it from falling over, they were preserving a structure that had been visibly imperfect since before Joan of Arc was born. Napoleon was not short. Napoleon was not short. Napoleon Bonaparte stands in history as the archetypal short man, the original Napoleon complex, an overcorrecting dictator driven by feelings of inadequacy about his height. He was not short. Napoleon measured 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, roughly average height or above average for a Frenchman of his time. The myth arose largely from a misunderstanding. Napoleon's nickname among his troops was Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a term of affection, not a description of his height. He was also frequently surrounded by his imperial guard, whose minimum height was 5 feet 10, genuinely tall men who made Napoleon look shorter by comparison. A contribution came from British propaganda cartoonist James Gillray, who consistently drew Napoleon as a tiny ranting figure, while depicting Pitt and other British figures as towering. British audiences absorbed this image eagerly. The confusion was compounded by a difference between French and English inches. Napoleon's documented height of 5'2" in French units translated to 5'7" in English units, and somewhere in translation, the French measurement stuck without the conversion. Napoleon was a megalomaniac and a military genius. He was not, by any measure, short. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of ancient Egypt, was not ethnically Egyptian. She was Macedonian Greek. The royal dynasty she belonged to, the Ptolemaic dynasty, was founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I, following Alexander's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC. For 275 years, this Greek royal family ruled Egypt, but largely refused to assimilate into Egyptian culture. They spoke Greek, maintained Macedonian court customs, and intermarried almost exclusively within the dynasty. Cleopatra VII is notable precisely because she was, by ancient accounts, the first ruler of her dynasty to actually learn to speak Egyptian, in addition to several other languages. She also adopted Egyptian religious customs and political imagery for strategic reasons, presenting herself as the goddess Isis to her Egyptian subjects. The image of Cleopatra as an Egyptian woman with dark coal-lined eyes and elaborate headdresses is an aesthetic and political choice she made, not an ethnicity she was born into. The woman most associated with ancient Egypt was culturally and biologically Greek, a descendant of one of Alexander's generals, who had ruled a foreign country for 9 generations. The pyramids were not built by slaves. The pyramids were not built by slaves. The popular image of Egyptian pharaohs driving thousands of enslaved people to build the pyramids is wrong. Archaeological evidence gathered since the 1990s, including the discovery of workers' villages near Giza, shows that the pyramid builders were paid workers, Egyptian citizens who received food, medical care, and were buried with honor near the pyramids they built when they died. We have found their bakeries, their breweries, their hospitals, and their tombs. The workers were organized into crews with names. One crew called themselves Friends of Khufu. They ate meat regularly, which was a sign of significant status in the ancient world. When workers were injured or sick, their bones show evidence of medical treatment and recovery. Some workers appear to have been buried with what were considered honorable funerals. This doesn't mean the work was comfortable or voluntary in the modern sense. Ancient labor was compelled in many ways by economic necessity and social obligation. But the image of whip-wielding overseers and chains comes from a much later historical imagination, not from what the archaeological record actually shows. The first computer programmer was a woman born in 1815. The first computer programmer was a woman born in 1815. Ada Lovelace was the daughter of the poet Lord Byron and was born in 1815, 2 years before Jane Austen died, and over a century before any electronic computer existed. In the 1840s, she worked with mathematician Charles Babbage on his proposed analytical engine, a mechanical computing machine that was never actually built in their lifetimes. Lovelace wrote what is now recognized as the first computer algorithm, a step-by-step procedure intended to be processed by a machine, designed to calculate Bernoulli numbers. She also wrote notes describing concepts that would not be widely understood for another century. The idea that a machine could manipulate symbols, beyond mere numbers, that it could compose music if given the right rules, that computing could extend far beyond arithmetic. Her notes were so far ahead of their time that they were essentially ignored until Alan Turing referenced them in the 1940s while developing the theoretical foundations of modern computing. The world's first programmer was a Victorian woman who died at 36, whose work lay dormant for 100 years, and whose contributions were only recognized in full by the late 20th century. The last American Civil War widow died in 2008. The last American Civil War widow died in 2008. The American Civil War ended in 1865. Maudie Hopkins died in 2008 at the age of 93. She had married William Cantrell, a Confederate veteran, in 1934, when she was 19 years old and he was 86. This kind of marriage, between young women and elderly veterans receiving pensions, was not uncommon in poverty-stricken parts of the American South during the Great Depression. It meant that the human connection to the Civil War extended all the way into the 21st century. The last verified widow of a Union veteran, Gertrude Janeway, died in 2003. In 2008, when the iPhone was newly released, when Barack Obama was campaigning for the presidency, when the global financial crisis was beginning, there was still a living person with a direct legal and intimate connection to a war fought between 1861 and 1865. The past does not stay in the past. Living people carry it forward in ways that compress centuries into a single human lifespan. The Black Death may have helped cause the Renaissance. The Black Death may have helped cause the Renaissance. The Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. Tens of millions of people dead in 5 years. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. And it may have created the conditions for the Renaissance. The plague killed indiscriminately across social classes, which disrupted the rigid feudal hierarchy that had locked most Europeans into inherited social positions. With so many people dead, surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in dramatically increased demand. Wages rose. Serfdom began to unravel in Western Europe. Economic mobility increased. Surviving heirs inherited wealth from multiple dead relatives, concentrating capital in fewer hands, some of whom used that wealth to patronize artists and scholars. The trauma also shook confidence in the church, which had been unable to explain or prevent the disaster, opening space for new intellectual frameworks. The Italian city-states, already mercantile and relatively wealthy, emerged from the plague with disrupted but resilient economies and a newly mobile educated class. The Renaissance that began in Florence in the late 14th century is not directly caused by the Black Death alone, but the catastrophe rearranged the social and economic conditions of Europe in ways that made it possible. Albert Einstein failed his entrance exam. Albert Einstein failed his entrance exam. In 1895, the 16-year-old Albert Einstein applied to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, now known as ETH Zurich, and failed the entrance examination. He passed the mathematics and physics sections comfortably, but failed the French language and botany sections, which he found boring and irrelevant. He was rejected. The school's director, recognizing his exceptional performance in math and physics, recommended he finish his secondary school education first and reapply. Einstein spent a year at a school in Aarau, Switzerland, where he reportedly had a formative and happy experience, before successfully gaining admission to the Polytechnic in 1896. 12 years later, in 1905, he published 4 groundbreaking papers in a single year: the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, special relativity, and the mass energy equivalence expressed as E equals mc squared, any one of which would have made him one of the most important physicists in history. The man who would win the Nobel Prize and become the defining image of scientific genius was rejected from his first-choice university for failing botany. The lesson is not inspirational so much as accurate. Institutional gatekeeping is a poor instrument for identifying intellectual greatness. The invention of the telephone started a race to the patent office, the telephone patent race. Alexander Graham Bell is credited with inventing the telephone. but the historical truth is murkier and more dramatic. On February 14, 1876, both Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray filed paperwork at the U.S. Patent Office related to the telephone on the same day. The order in which they arrived has been disputed ever since. Bell was awarded the patent, but Gray and his supporters argued for years that Gray arrived first and that the patent examiner, who had a financial interest in Bell's company, improperly allowed Bell's application to take priority. The controversy was never fully resolved. Numerous lawsuits followed. Bell ultimately prevailed in court, and the Bell Telephone Company became one of the most powerful corporations in American history. But Elisha Gray spent the rest of his life believing, with substantial evidence, that credit for one of the most transformative inventions in history had been wrongly taken from him. The history of invention is full of these near misses where priority came down to hours or procedural decisions rather than the act of invention itself. The name on the patent and the person who actually had the idea are often not the same. Betty White was older than sliced bread. Betty White was older than sliced bread. Betty White was born on January 17, 1922. Sliced bread was first sold commercially on July 7, 1928, in Chillicothe, Missouri, using Otto Frederick Rohwitter's bread slicing machine. Betty White was already 6 years old when pre-sliced bread entered the world. This fact went viral when Betty White died on December 31, 2021. Just shy of her 100th birthday, and it is entirely accurate. The observation feels absurd because we think of sliced bread as impossibly basic and ancient, and Betty White as a beloved but mortal entertainer. In fact, sliced bread is a remarkably recent innovation. For most of human history, for virtually all of the history of bread, which goes back at least 14,000 years, bread was not pre-sliced. The automatic bread slicer was considered such a significant innovation that it spawned the phrase, "the greatest thing since sliced bread," and yet a person who lived within living memory was born before it existed. Betty White's lifespan bookended the entire history of sliced bread from invention to the present. Anne Frank and Martin Luther King were born the same year. Anne Frank and Martin Luther King. Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929. They were born in the same year, 5 months apart. Anne Frank died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in February or March 1945, when she was 15 years old. Martin Luther King Jr. survived, went on to lead the American Civil Rights Movement, delivered the "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and was assassinated in 1968 at age 39. Had Anne Frank survived the Holocaust, she would have been the same age as Martin Luther King throughout his entire public career. She would have been 34 during the March on Washington. Both were born into a world where systematic persecution of people based on their identity was legally sanctioned and widely practiced. One did not survive it. One spent his life fighting it. Their simultaneous births in 1929 collapsed the distance between the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement into a single generation. The same year, the same human moment, two utterly different fates. The Apollo 11 computer had less power than a modern greeting card. The Apollo 11 computer. The Apollo guidance computer, the onboard computer that navigated the lunar module and helped land Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon in 1969, had a processor running at approximately 0.043 MHz and 4 kilobytes of RAM. A modern musical greeting card, the kind that plays a tune when you open it, contains a chip that is roughly 100 times more powerful. The smartphone in your pocket is approximately 1 trillion times more capable. Yet the Apollo guidance computer successfully calculated trajectories, managed life support systems, and guided a spacecraft to a soft landing on another celestial body. The engineers who built it did so without modern compilers, without internet access to reference materials, without the ability to test in realistic conditions until the actual mission, and with manufacturing tolerances that seem laughable by modern standards. The achievement was not computational power, it was extraordinary human ingenuity applied to severe constraints. The moon landing was not made possible by advanced computers. It was made possible by mathematicians who compensated for the limitations of primitive computers through exceptional skill and preparation. Thank you for watching. History is not a story happening far away and long ago. It is a tangled web of overlapping timelines, where the ancient and the modern are constantly touching each other in unexpected places. If these facts surprised you, go looking for more. The actual historical record is far stranger than the simplified version we're usually taught. Subscribe for more content like this, and we'll see you in the next video.